Welcome to Teal Talk, a podcast brought to you by the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence. That's OAESV for short. We're your hosts, Taylor
and Lori.
In each episode, we speak with professionals in the field to dive deep into the intersectional issues that affect survivors in Ohio.
Before we begin, we want to give a content warning that we will be discussing sexual violence and other issues that may be upsetting and triggering. If you need help, please feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. Please take care of yourself.
Hello, and welcome back to Teal Talk. I am your host, Lori Hamami, the Communications and Resource Coordinator at OAESV. My co-host, Taylor, will not be joining us today, but we have a special guest on today that will make it just as exciting. We have OAESV's Sarah Ferrato. Sarah, they, is the Manager of Sexual Violence Prevention and Public Health Initiatives at the Ohio Alliance to End Sexual Violence, and has worked in the anti-violence movement professionally and unprofessionally for almost a decade. Their liberation philosophy is grounded in pleasure-centered community empowerment frameworks supported by imagination, mutual aid, and grassroots organizing. Sarah holds a bachelor's degree in art history with a focus on women's studies from Kent State University and a certificate in adolescent sex education basics from Rutgers University. She co-parents 3 chaotic cats with her partner, and they are a novice forager, community organizer, and impulsive book buyer. As a typical Libra, you will find scattered, half-finished DIY projects throughout their Cleveland home. Hello, Sarah. Welcome to Teal Talk.
Hi, Lori. Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
I am too. I actually don't think I knew you had a degree in art history, and I feel like being artistic makes sense with your role in prevention because you have to be creative to think of all these different ways to engage people of different ages and stages of life.
Yes. Yeah. I often tell folks when I'm doing like the elevator pitch that my art history degree informs a lot of my prevention because art is kind of the backdrop or the mirror of our entire lives, and it can be used as a form of revolution or repression, depending on how it's used. And so it really informs how I envision and also learn about prevention and all the ways that it has been happening throughout history leading up to today, which I think helps us to better understand and approach things in a way that's not replicating strategies that haven't worked before. So yeah, I really like art history,
We all take unique paths to get to this field, and we just all end up here somehow.
Yes.
All roads lead to anti-violence prevention.
Correct.
Well, I guess I didn't even mention what we were talking about today. I was just too excited to talk with you. A few episodes ago, we had a couple other OAESV staff on and chatted about the documentary series Quiet on Set, which details the abusive behind-the-scenes world of children's television during Dan Schneider's tenure as a producer. So if you haven't checked out that episode, I definitely would go back and listen to part 1, because in this episode, we're going to dive in a little bit more into the prevention aspect, since we have Miss Prevention here herself.
Little Miss Prevention.
Yes, that's exactly what I was picturing.
Yes, I'm excited to dive into this and really encourage folks to listen to both episodes because I think it's going to paint a really holistic picture of kind of the work we do and how these sorts of series land for us as folks in the field.
Yeah, there's definitely a lot of things that I want to touch on, but as an overview, I feel a lot of people watch these documentaries. A lot of people like to watch true crime or just like trauma porn. I say that in quotes. And they get to the end of it and think, well, that's terrible. And then nothing really comes of it. So I definitely want to touch a little bit on like what now? Now that this documentary is out in the world, what actual actionable steps could we take to prevent something like this from ever happening again? Before we dive into the meat of the episode, I'd love to just hear your thoughts on the documentary in general, both personally and professionally.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to start off by kind of saying that I parted ways with true crime a few years ago after reading a lot of critiques regarding white feminism and how that interacts with true crime, and also reflecting on like what was I getting out of it. And I think I came into this series doing a similar thing. I think one of the things that we often miss when we are engaging with incredibly traumatizing content or content that is incredibly explicit, especially when we're talking about violence, is that we're not talking about critical media critique or studies, and we are not taught that ever throughout our lives. We are consumers and we are supposed to passively take in this information, and that without really considering the source of like who's making this, why it's being made, who was involved in the decisions with it being made, and like what is the purpose. And that can mean something different to every single person, but there is always going to be a motivation for why that content's being created. And so I think I approached this series with a similar critical eye, understanding that like as a survivor, so thinking about like my personal approach to this, but then also my professional approach of like, okay, are we going to get to that what now, right? Because oftentimes when we see documentaries, it is often a reflective story and it leaves it unfinished. And I don't have a critique of that because I think it's incredibly important that we don't always create prescriptive models for how we engage with this sort of content, especially like memoir or documentary-based content. But coming into this series, both as a professional and personally impacted by a variety of different forms of violence, I want to be transparent that like I didn't watch the final episode. The fifth episode, although from what I read from the synopsis is that it is kind of a synopsis of the documentary itself with some unseen footage, and that it may dive a little bit deeper into some of the interviews. And so when I watched this series, and I just watched it throughout last week leading up to today, I actually had to turn it off after the second episode because I had such a visceral response that I knew that my body was too dysregulated to continue. So I guess I just say that as a heed of warning to folks, or, just mindfulness that when you come into this, there's really explicit content being described as well as first person descriptions. Because as folks will learn, if you haven't already seen the series, is that Drake Bell, who is one of the main victims of pretty horrendous abuse at the hands of Brian Peck, and also like all of the surrounding culture that allowed for that to happen, he is there to talk about his story. And so as I was watching through, there were a few things that came to mind. Firstly, the very obvious missing piece of Amanda Bynes being able to tell her own story. I think one of the reasons why I had to turn it off after the second episode was that a lot of folks were telling her story on behalf of her. And just from like a perspective of ethical storytelling, that felt pretty egregious as far as ethical storytelling is concerned, while also understanding that she has been so publicly kind of maligned in the media over the years for a variety of mental health issues and responses, rightfully, to whatever has happened to her during that time at Nickelodeon, which we don't know because she wasn't there to tell her story. Some other things that really came up for me personally was how singularly there was a focus on Dan Schneider for creating the culture that was Nickelodeon. Rightfully, I think that there are definite critiques of like positional power and who has it and how they create a culture. But I think one of the things that was missing for me was at the very end of episode 4, they had this explanation of Dan Schneider kind of responding and saying like the makeup decisions, the costume decisions, the content decisions all went through a number of hands at Nickelodeon and not just like top-down decisions made by Dan Schneider. And so I think it's really important from a prevention standpoint as we dive deeper to talk about why it's so critically important that we talk about culture that allows for the conditions that create abusive environments. There were so many different things that came up, but I think lastly, another kind of huge piece was this binary of victimhood and perpetration that I think we do a real disservice as even professionals in the field of creating. Because what we know is that Drake Bell experienced horrendous incidents of abuse at a very early age. And that partially why I had such a visceral reaction was understanding that like the story that we were being told through this docuseries was going to focus so narrowly on that and not him as a whole person, with the understanding that cycles of abuse happen when we don't provide safety nets and support to people who've experienced horrendous acts of violence. And so the fact that Drake Bell's history then moving on and also committing some pretty horrendous acts of violence and just experiencing like a lot of what can be kind of characterized as trauma responses were just kind of glossed over. And so I think that one of the ways that we could take this conversation is really talking about what it means to unknowingly or unintentionally perpetuate the perfect victim myth and why it's so important for us to dispel that, because what we know is that like cycles of abuse, cycles of violence are a thing, are a real thing. And oftentimes it's coming out of the carceral responses that actually focus in on just punishing people without offering any kind of support to anyone who has been impacted by the violence at hand. So I would say that those are some pretty major takeaways from the docuseries that I'm still sitting and reflecting with, because I've only just, recently finished up the series, and I might have like a million more perspectives or different feelings even a month from now about how it was done, what message it was sending, and really like the biggest takeaways.
Yeah, I felt like I had all my thoughts and feelings sorted, and then you opened your mouth and I was like, wait, I'm feeling a million new things. Yeah, I really liked what you said about Amanda Bynes and how, I can't even think of the right word, her not being there to tell her own story. Survivors don't owe us anything. I'm going to say that again. Survivors do not owe us anything. And I think it's hard for me to believe that producers of a documentary were being trauma informed in that process, because they wouldn't have included mentions of Amanda Bynes if they were. And I guarantee they may not have said it out loud, but in the back of their minds, they're thinking, gosh, if Amanda would just come tell her story, this documentary could make so much more money. Feels very icky. And when you think about Drake Bell, he came on willingly to tell his story. And a lot of people might think, yeah, sharing a story for a survivor can be a very liberating experience. But I still think that there's a difference between Drake Bell approaching producers and saying, I'm ready, versus how we know that this came about was producers reaching out to Drake Bell and saying, will you share your story? There's a difference there, definitely.
There is. And it's making me, now that you're kind of like reflecting back and building on that, there are a couple of other, I think, more systemic takeaways, is also the intersections of like how we disempower and take agency away from and quite literally hate children. The fact that we think in any capacity it's okay to engage in child labor, and that systems of capitalism make that acceptable, is just another risk factor in which we have denied bodily autonomy to people. And this idea that like children are empty vessels that we fill, it's such an undermining of the brilliance and the knowledge and the experiences that young people bring to the world. I often think about in prevention work, especially if you talk to like very young kids who have yet to be socialized into like how to think about things, is that they're little philosophers. They can say something and it will just blow you away. And so this idea that we are creating environments in which children are now experiencing the pressure of economically supporting their families, potentially experiencing abusive relationships or exploitative relationships with the people who they are supposed to trust, and that they're not protected, that nobody's speaking up for them, or even more so, we're not listening and we're devaluing what young people are telling us. Because there were so many instances in the docuseries where many of the child actors who were interviewed were talking about feeling unable to speak up, fear of losing their jobs. One that really stuck with me that I think is another kind of, it's a reflection of racial capitalism, is Brian Hearn, who said, I got this job to quite literally get my family out of the hood. And another systemic takeaway is generational trauma that actually helps people better identify warning signs of things that just your spidey senses are just heightened. And I think that that's incredibly true of Black mothers who systemically have experienced generational trauma in racial capitalism on a multitude of levels, whose voices and experiences are devalued, and who also have to engage with young Black boys, especially at a very early age, to not sugarcoat what it means to be a Black boy in the world. And so for her to speak up and be the squeaky wheel, right, about hey, this feels off, this is not okay, and for them not to be invited back just also reflects this undermining and the calculations that were made culturally to not speak up and not address the issues and the disparities at hand. And even keeping the parents separate from the young people. There were just so many instances in which we're watching this power over dynamic happen to young people who should have agency to decide what is best for them. And capitalism and patriarchy and racism and ableism as well, because as these child actors are transitioning into adulthood, many of them are experiencing conservatorships. They're being deemed unfit to manage their funds, to manage their lives, and that now they've experienced their whole lives of having their agency taken away from them. They're thrown into adulthood without the skills to become adults, and then their adulthoods are taken away as well. So those are a lot of different prongs, but it is a systemic issue. And one of the major issues that I had with the docuseries is that I wanted so badly to make it an individualistic issue when it really is a systemic one.
Well, it's just supposed to be fun, right? You're on children's TV. This is also fun. And you're so right. I'd love to tap in to the toxic work environment and how you create toxic environments to breed this type of behavior, because there's this kind of weird dynamic where the child actors were in a weird toxic work environment, and then the adults were also in a toxic work environment, and then it was just a mess.
So many of the adults who thought that they were doing right by their kids, and I think that that's another piece that I took real issue with, is the docuseries. I think not only did I think that the docuseries did a disservice to the adults, especially the parents in the situation, but as I was reading the discourse, because there was just an unending amount of discourse online, was demonizing the parents for not having stepped in. But the reality is we had so many instances in the series where parents did step in, or guardians did step in, or concerned adults did step in. And what happened? They got ostracized. They got uninvited back. They were fired. There were all sorts of interruptions that were attempting to happen. There was one parent who talked about specifically Jason Handy, who was the PA, who was a registered sex offender, who had made it past the background check to become the PA. And he really gained the trust of this young person and their parent. And so when he exchanged email addresses with a young person, they didn't flag it as an issue because he had gained that trust. And when he sent those explicit sexual images and videos of himself via email, and that young person trusted her parent enough to tell her. And I think that's a piece that like got glossed over so readily. And it is such a pivotal piece of prevention, is that when young people have trusted adults they can go to disclose that something has happened to them, that interruption can happen. And it did. And that parent started to weigh their decisions. The shame that we create with adults around like allowing, quote unquote, their young people to be harmed plays so far into this cycle of like not doing anything about it or keeping it to themselves, and the shame that builds up. And she recognized too, on top of that, right, the shame of like, I can't believe I allowed this person to get close to us, when in reality, we know that that was a calculation. But then on top of it, she explicitly named that she didn't get the police involved and didn't report this. And I think that particular piece is critical to think about and talk about, because she was weighing a lot of different things. And we know that the family policing system, also known as child protective services, the child welfare system, is not neutral, and that it actually deeply harms a lot of folks, separates families based on the systems not providing resources enough for folks to get support, and then in turn demonizes the parent and pulls that child out of their supportive environment. So if this young person trusts her parent enough to come to her with this, to interrupt the violence, and then she chooses to call the police and the family policing system gets involved, that child is likely now taken from the adult that they trust. And what kind of message and what kind of programming does that do to a young person who's developing their sense of relationships and trust to people as they're trying to figure out why this person who they trusted betrayed that trust, right? And now it just continues this cycle of distrust. So I think that there's really these poignant moments in the docuseries that get glossed over where prevention and interruption did happen, that I wish, had they had somebody on set who was trained to recognize those pieces, could have honed in a little bit more on.
Yeah, because we got that picture of the child telling her mom, and then on the flip side, instances where, you know, Drake Bell didn't tell anyone for a very, very long time. And we discussed in episode 1, like feeling these moments of frustration, like why won't you just tell someone, or feeling frustrated with a parent for not acting in a way that we wanted them to. And then, you know, having just take a step back and realize like, these are just my projections. I think it is natural to feel frustrated, but I'm wondering if we can talk a little bit more about toxic environments and what we can do to better prevent them.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And there's like a couple of different things that come to mind. We can talk about the incremental improvements that happen, but at kind of the foundation of all of this is an exploitative capitalist system that creates a situation in which oftentimes, I mean, we were hearing from a lot of the child actors and their families that many of them were not like rich by any means, you know, that many of these young people were engaging in this work as a contributor to their household. Something that isn't explicitly kind of explored a little bit more is Jeanette McCurdy, but I read her memoir, I'm Glad My Mom Died, and she talks at length about this, about the amount of responsibility and amount of exploitation and amount of manipulation that she experienced through her mom, while her dad attempted to interrupt these behaviors. But ultimately, she felt that responsibility to her family to economically support them. There are so many different instances in which that's taking place. And so it can be really easy to blame the parents or the adults in that situation for deciding that was the best thing to do. And it's not taking accountability away, right? To say that that is an important piece of the puzzle, that exploiting children at a very young age to economically support their families is like a not okay thing to do. But if we zoom out and we start to really think about prevention from like a community and systemic level, what does that say about our culture at large? What does that say about our society at large? That people literally can't survive under the current systems that exist. And so they'd rather risk the toxic environments that have now been like deeply documented. Like, it isn't new that child stars experience like a multitude of abuses, a multitude of exploitation and exploitative behaviors. So it's not new to us, but we keep just like kind of deciding that the cycle needs to continue, but that removing individual bad actors is the way to go, when we really know that systemic change has to happen. So short of abolishing racial capitalism, it can also look like, what is the point? Why do we need entertainment that includes child actors? And like, why do we need these entertainment, kind of outlets, right? What does it say about our larger society that we need this kind of entertainment? But then also, like, what are the labor laws there and who's actually enforcing them? Because we also know that child labor laws exist on those sets, and yet they were overstepping them constantly. And when you are engaging in a power over dynamic where these young kids are like, this is a mentor to me, this is somebody I look up to, this is somebody who also controls my paycheck. And then also I have my parents over here telling me that like I need to be doing this. Is there really agency or informed consent happening when they say, yeah, sure, I'll stay over? There isn't. And so I think it's kind of twofold, is like, we really need to grapple with where we are at with racial capitalism and how we are in late stage capitalism and how nothing is sustainable anymore. And then also about adult supremacy. Adult supremacy and the ways that we engage with children as empty vessels is like, I think the thing that we often gloss over and we don't even talk about as part of the like oppressive systems that allow for conditions of violence to happen. So I think it's really having to check in with, why do we hate children so much? I don't mean for that to be like in a facetious way, although it often can land like that, but like truly, I think we really need to grapple with as a society, especially, and I want to clarify, like a Western culture, why we decide that children are lesser than and can't engage in meaningful decision making. Especially if we're going to truly be trauma informed and survivor centered, we have to understand that like meeting people where they are, including young people, and not deciding on behalf of them is critical.
I think also touching on the fact that it is important to have trusted people or people listening to what these children actually want. Even on these sets, like most of the time children were like, my dream is to be an actor or actress, and my parent is just supporting my dream. But if that child went up to that parent and said, I don't want to do this anymore, it needs to be okay that they don't want to do this anymore. In part one, we touched a little bit on how we're seeing this shift of child entertainment to like social media and parents like exploiting their children's for social media fame and money. And I think in that case, it gets even dicier because it's your parent. It's not, Dan Schneider or some other entity. There's not like a third party. It's parents and kid. I don't think that this problem is going away. So I think while the documentary may have shed some light on the issue at hand and maybe brought people's attention who didn't really know it was that big of a problem, I guess what now? You jokingly said, like, aside from abolishing an entire system, what are more like tangible action steps that just the average person watching this can do?
When I think about practical application, so meaning like, what are systems of prevention and intervention, or what are actions of intervention and prevention? I really think that we don't have to abolish a system necessarily outright. Abolition starts with yourself. abolition starts with unlearning the things that led you to believe that like carceral systems or systems of punishment are legitimate forms of justice. And that is from a systemic view, because I understand that there are many people who seek justice in criminal legal systems. And what we often know to be true is that that can be an incredibly re-traumatizing experience. There's often not trauma-informed engagement in any capacity. And ultimately, we are actually expanding sexual violence and all forms of violence, because now we're just putting it behind a wall where we can forget about the people there. And in prisons, some of the most heinous acts of violence happen. And because we dehumanize folks who are incarcerated, that we don't recognize that as part of the systemic issue. And so what I mean by abolishing are thoughts and behaviors that add on to punishment and retribution, meaning that what we can sometimes do is create binaries. And I think this is actually going to move us into dispelling the perfect victim, to be quite honest, is that what this docuseries tended to do is, without saying it outright, paint Dan Schneider as a monster. And what we know to be true is that Dan Schneider did a lot of bad, that his behavior was incredibly toxic. It allowed for the culture at Nickelodeon to be as such. He was not only complicit, but like an active participant in creating like power dynamics with young people that resulted in really questionable to outright inappropriate content for young people. And not only that, was also engaging in abusive behaviors like quid pro quo behaviors, where he was like having costumers give him massages on set and those sorts of things. But what we also know to be true from the mouths of the child actors was that Dan Schneider was also a mentor, was somebody who they looked to for support, who, especially in the early days, was somebody who they trusted and loved. And he was beloved by many. That's all to say that this is much more complicated than we often make it, right? And that it's not one person or the responsibility of us to decide whether or not a particular person is identified as a monster. What that can actually do is it can undermine survivors and their healing journeys. And what I mean by that is, if we say on behalf of a survivor that that person is a monster, if that survivor doesn't look at that person as a monster and doesn't look at that person as somebody who neatly fits in the box of perpetrator, but is somebody who they have a complicated relationship to. Because if we know that over 80% of sexual violence incidents that are reported are by somebody the survivor knows, it's often that we have some type of a relationship with them. And it can be really, really complicated in a legal criminal system when we start to paint that person as a very squarely like monster narrative. Because what it does is it disempowers survivors, saying like, you made a bad decision because you chose to love or care for a monster. And so it starts to really perpetuate, even unintentionally, we do it in the field all the time, it unintentionally perpetuates a stigma around the survivor that like they could have made a different decision. They could have chosen not to love a quote unquote monster. And therefore what happened to them was a natural outcome. And so we are reinforcing the perfect victim narrative. We are victim blaming. And so what it really can mean is like, I watched that docuseries and I thought to myself, my heart breaks for Drake. My heart breaks for Jeanette. My heart breaks for Amanda. My heart breaks for Brian. My heart breaks for all of those children who are navigating adulthood with that level of trauma. It also breaks my heart to know that the people they trusted betrayed that trust. And that is incredibly complicated. And for anyone to say that they don't still have feelings of care or complication with somebody who has historically broken their trust, I think that that's like a disingenuous thing to say, right? I know for myself as a survivor who has reconciled with some people who have caused me harm. And reconcile, I mean that I haven't reconciled with that person, but I have reconciled with myself what that person means in the world at large and how I interact with them, is that they are a whole person who engaged in a behavior that hurt me. And it doesn't make sense for me necessarily to let them know they hurt me, but to know that like that's a complicated thing because I am still in relationship to some of those folks. And I have let some folks know that they have harmed me. And I think that like also honoring the bravery that it takes to be an imperfect person as a survivor and still come forward. I mean, look at the ways that we've demonized Amanda Bynes in the media, and we have narrowed her experience down to erratic mental health crises, and how that undermines her survivorship, whatever that is, because we don't necessarily know the extent. But to know that, again, we're perpetuating these kind of perfect victim myths when we engage with media like this without thinking about the holistic outcomes and the relationships that were severed and impacted and changed forever. And I kind of want to land on one last piece because I think it can be really complicated to talk about people who have harmed as whole people. But one of the things that also we have to take into consideration is like also the ripple effects that happen. So not only did Brian Peck complicate and interrupt the relationship between Drake and his dad, where he knew he needed to distance Drake from his dad because he was a trusted adult who was questioning Brian Peck's behavior. But then we're also talking about the continued cycle of violence that Drake then went on to uphold. And so, like, what does it mean for us to hold the nuanced compassion and empathy for people who have experienced harm, who have also harmed people? And what I think can sometimes flatten that nuanced conversation and exploration are docuseries like this that don't leave folks with complications. And so kind of going back to like abolishing this carcerality in our own brains is like, how do we more critically engage with the media that is being fed to us and we're consuming to understand that like this narrative is still perpetuating rape culture, even though it's framed as being a counteract to that.
Do you think documentaries like this are even necessary?
Not to continue down the like complicated path, but I think that there's complications. So if we even zoom out, right, we see the Me Too movement and how this docuseries actually was uplifting that Dan Schneider wasn't even fired until the Me Too movement came about and it empowered survivors to come forward with their stories. But I think it's also really important for us to talk about that in a larger container because like who was able to come forward and who saw like quote unquote justice for whatever that meant to them. And so when we think about the Me Too movement, that we saw this pendulum swing, right? Where there was such empowerment of survivors to tell their stories. And then there was like, but then what? Because now there are articles that are coming out that are very critical of the Me Too movement because it raised awareness, but it did this cycle thing, right? It's like rape culture was over here. We knew it was like entwined and ingrained into our culture. And so, of course, the different ways that it shows up were invisibilized. This critical mass happens where there's a bravery in speaking up and naming what has happened that helps to build critical consciousness, like societal consciousness, so that awareness and outreach is happening. So like, what does it look like to support survivors and believe survivors, and which survivors are we believing? Because Tarana Burke's original iteration of Me Too was overlooked until Alyssa Milano tweeted this out almost a decade later. But then it's like, then what? Because the critiques of Me Too have come out because globally it hasn't necessarily changed a whole lot for folks beyond just raising consciousness and actually pushing the pendulum in the other direction and really causing a backlash to like PC culture, or like nobody can say anything anymore these days, or what do I have to sign a contract? I think that us getting really reflective about the strategies we use in the field to not just like outright dismiss that pendulum swing back of like critique against the Me Too movement is also reflective of like what we mean by the documentaries and like whether or not they're a helpful thing. Because it is, to your point from the beginning, was like, what is the documentary asking us to do beyond just take in this like horrendous story and continue on with this kind of like true crime trauma porn? What does it mean to move beyond and say like, okay, what are the critics saying about this? And one of the pieces that I think is very important is like, okay, so we have to sign a contract now to like have sex. While oftentimes that is in bad faith, we hear it from young people and adults alike. And we have to do a little bit more digging into our prevention strategies and say, what is our responsibility or our role in that being the watered down takeaway of the work we're doing? Meaning, how are we teaching consent from a prescriptive model that says, here's the checklist? And then we get mad at the people who are like, yeah, but like, what do I need to do with the checklist? You know, because like if people are like, well, I have to sign this contract to make sure that like I got consent. And it's like, well, if we're teaching it that way, why wouldn't we expect people to then be critical when they're like, well, I did the thing? It's saying that that's not enough. So that's a roundabout way of saying that like documentaries can be really helpful for consciousness raising, can be really helpful for awareness, but like how much more awareness do we necessarily need, especially awareness of people in positions of power? Even if we're talking about disempowerment of young people, they still held a level of power that the average young person does not, meaning that like they're not on set with a bunch of people. They aren't making a paycheck. They're not, there's so many different layers of like, okay, so what does it mean to do that docuseries, blame individuals, and not reckon with the systems that allow for this to happen? It's often like what we see as quote unquote cancel culture, which actually isn't cancel culture at all. What it is that we get enraged about a charismatic leader who is doing some egregious stuff. We permanently or temporarily remove them from power, which actually is a transformative approach to accountability, to say, you still can reside in this community, but you no longer get to have the power that you did because you misused that power. But then they just come back. And we as a culture accept them back with open arms, even with the smaller group yelling, this isn't okay. There isn't a time limit on like this type of accountability. So to kind of like wrap that wild winding thought up is like that it's complicated, that we live in a world in which media exists and we exist as an extension of media and vice versa. And like it is a really powerful tool to mobilize people if it's used with the intent of mobilizing. But as many of these documentaries stand, they stand for entertainment and for passive consumerism. And I think that's a real disservice to the people who bravely came forward. And to put an addendum on that is that I don't believe that the people who engaged in this did it in vain in any capacity. I deeply appreciate and have so much reverence and compassion and empathy for the folks who are part of this docuseries who shared their stories. And I just wish that the decision makers in all of our spaces were more careful with those stories and more intentional with that content.
Yeah. I thank you for sharing all of that. As you were talking, I kept thinking about bringing prevention into schools and how when people talk about teaching prevention to kiddos or teens, it's always focused on don't have sex or like consent, when really if we want to teach kids about prevention, it goes so far beyond that to so many of the points that you made today, like critically looking at the media, learning how to apologize, setting boundaries, having trusted people that you can talk to. And how the heck are we supposed to teach all that when they give us a 30-minute slot once a year? So,
yes.
Yeah.
And what does it look like for us to move beyond education? Because we know that education alone doesn't change culture. And ultimately, like, we have to grapple with the fact that, like, we all operate under systems of oppression and that we are often complicit in upholding systems of oppression. And so what does it take for the people on set, as we were talking about? It wasn't Dan Schneider making these decisions alone. It was really convenient for Viacom and Nickelodeon to fire him in 2018 when the Me Too movement was at fever pitch. But what does it mean for us to teach how to be brave together, to stand up to systems that are exploiting us, that are violent? And what does it mean to unlearn individualistic behaviors? Like, each of us is responsible for ourselves, and shift that into we are responsible for each other.
Mic drop. Yeah, I think that perfectly wrapped everything up. It's like the OAESV mantra. There's power and strength in the collective. So
that's exactly right.
Well, thank you so much, Sarah, for letting me pick your brain and sharing all the knowledge that you have in there, and being vulnerable and sharing your own personal stories as well.
Yeah, thanks for creating a container where it's possible.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Sarah.
Yeah, thanks, Lori.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Teal Talk. We hope you enjoyed our deep dive into intersectional issues affecting survivors in Ohio. If you like what you heard, subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating and review, recommend us to a friend, and follow us on Instagram and Facebook at OAESV and Twitter at Ohio Alliance ESV. If you'd like to learn more about us and the services we offer, sign up for our email list, or read a transcript of this episode, visit oaesv.org.
Want to share a comment or ask a question for a future episode? Just click on the link in the show notes to leave us a voicemail. And remember, we're here to help. Feel free to call our resource line at 888-886-8388 during regular business hours, or the Ohio Sexual Violence Helpline 24/7 at 844-644-6435. See you next time.